Japan up close.
For Japan to reduce its reliance on foreign sources of energy, particularly imported fossil fuels, the really critical step is large-scale investments in renewable energy development across all categories, including solar, wind, geothermal, ocean energy, etc. Nuclear energy is certainly also important as medium-term bridging technology, although in the long term, given the risks to nuclear power plants in Japan due to Japan's location in a part of the world that's subject to earthquakes and volcanic activity and so forth, there may be a long-term rationale to phase out nuclear. But in the medium term, I think nuclear energy does have to be part of the solution as well. It's certainly possible for G7 countries to reach energy self-sufficiency. In fact, the United States and Canada are quite close to energy self-sufficiency as we speak. But the situation is very different for countries like Japan that has very limited access to traditional natural resources, including fossil fuels. And so the challenge is much greater for countries like Japan, and the emphasis needs to be on renewable energy sources as well as potentially more transformative sources of future energy. So one feature of global climate governance is what international relations scholars describe as regime complexity. This means that a variety of forms of cooperation have emerged with the increasing role of non-state actors as well as non-traditional models of cooperation. There are many institutions, organizations, and actors trying to address climate change. It's a very different world than the one that we might have seen in the 1950s when international organizations and states dominated the policy-making space. And this reality makes it possible for local governments to play an important role in addressing global public goods problems, including climate change. In the United States, for example, we've seen California playing a very proactive role in trying to leap ahead of the United States national level regulations, going back to fuel economy standards, but very much true in more recent years with decarbonization efforts as well. And the same can be said about cities. So things like the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, of which Tokyo is a member, is a very important initiative to try to bring cities to the forefront of best practices and coordination on climate action. And given the degree of urbanization that has taken place all over the world, these are quite important and potentially significant initiatives. Now, that said, ultimately, global public goods problems like climate change do require the involvement of national governments. Even if we can move the needle at the local level without national governments getting involved and pursuing solutions that cover entire nations and ultimately the entire world, it'll be difficult to reduce emissions to the degree necessary to reach decarbonization targets that countries have already pledged that they intend to meet. So although cities certainly are critical and can play a very important role, I would say ultimately we do need national governments to come on board as well. So energy security has been a long-term challenge for Japan, going back even to before World War II. If you recall, in the early phase of World War II for Japan, a major concern was the US embargo of oil that shut off a critical supply of energy resources for both Japan's economy and military. And some scholars would argue even that this was the key step that led to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, that essentially Japan felt that it only had a few years before its military would run out of the ability to engage in war, and therefore short-term strategy was necessary. But similar energy security concerns were evoked in the 1970s during the oil shock, obviously that created a major upheaval for not only Japan, but also for other countries, including the United States and those in Europe. Most observers at the time argued that Japan's response to the 1970s oil shock was quite effective, that the Japanese government was able to transition away from almost complete dependence on oil imports from the Middle East by developing nuclear energy, as well as promoting energy efficiency, basically the idea being to generate the same amount of economic growth while using the same or even less energy compared to before. So energy security as a challenge is not new at all for Japan, but certainly today it is a new phase of energy security as a problem in which new solutions are required. And ultimately, today for Japan, the solution will need to be energy self-sufficiency based on renewable energy, and thus the ability to reduce dependence on unstable sources of fossil fuel energy, like the Middle East and more recently, of course, Russia. So net zero for Japan is not just a climate objective, but also essentially a national security prerogative of the highest order. Japan needs to focus on decarbonization, not only as a way to contribute to the global objective of addressing climate change, but also to make sure that its own economy, its own sovereignty is secure. It's also important, of course, for Japan to continue improving energy efficiency and energy conservation measures, areas in which it's had traditional strengths, and to spread those technologies to other countries, particularly in the global south, where many countries are still at the early stages of decarbonization. And in the short term, to address energy security while renewable energies are still rolling out, certainly there is room for pursuing diversification policies to import fossil fuels from more reliable suppliers like Canada and Australia, hopefully doing so in a way that is consistent with Japan's climate change mitigation goals, such as green hydrogen. But in the long run, I think the key objective for Japan does need to be decarbonization. It will not only support global climate change efforts, but also ultimately Japan's own national self-interests. So climate change is an ongoing and urgent crisis in need of rapid solutions. So in this context, we shouldn't be thinking in terms of trade-offs between, on the one hand, promoting renewable energy sources like solar, wind, and geothermal that are already cost competitive on the one hand, and on the other hand, pursuing less cost competitive, less tested and developed alternatives, whether they be biofuels or the widespread use of hydrogen. The optimal strategy, not only for Japan, but for all governments with the capability and resources, is to support an all of the above strategy. Of course, albeit with some eye towards national comparative advantage and feasibility, but to support a variety of alternatives through measures like financial incentives, subsidies, and tax breaks, as well as promoting research and business collaboration to accelerate the development of new technologies. There will not necessarily be a single winner in terms of alternative energies. Each solution has distinct advantages and disadvantages. Solar energy, for example, is clearly going to be a central part of global decarbonization efforts, but it is unlikely to be a realistic solution for providing an alternative for jet fuel, for example. And this is an area where something like euglena-based biofuels may have important potential to provide a key solution. So developing innovative breakthrough technologies also remains a very important priority for countries like Japan. And it's important to note, of course, that if through the development of breakthrough technologies, Japan is able to promote climate change mitigation, this will also be an important benefit for Japanese business interests and on a larger scale, the Japanese economy as a whole. A major constraint in the evolution of Japan's energy and climate change policy since the 1990s has been politics. As I've shown in some of my own research, in Japan, the electoral system was reformed in the 1990s, and subsequently there have been administrative reforms. And the sum total effect of these changes has been that Japanese politicians have increasingly become sensitive to cost concerns of voters. And energy policies to promote transitions often impose costs. And furthermore, administrative reforms have meant that politicians are able to override Japan's bureaucracy that traditionally has been supportive of energy efficiency policies, for example. So if we look at the history of Japanese climate change policy since the 1990s, this is an era of disappointment. Japan has not been able to continue its admirable track record since the 1970s of improving energy efficiency. In fact, Japanese emissions grew in absolute terms during the Kyoto Commitment period, and Japan is oftentimes criticized now as being a laggard on climate change mitigation efforts. But a major question moving forward will be political leadership, and this goes right to the top. The priorities and preferences of Japanese leaders will matter considerably for the future course of Japanese climate change policy. Although the Japanese political system today makes demand-side measures, such as carbon taxes or increases in gasoline taxes, for example, those are quite difficult. Nonetheless, a supply-side transition based on a movement from fossil fuels towards renewable energy should still be politically feasible. So here I would say the will of leaders to step up and use their political capital to try to push for change will continue to matter quite a bit. Japan also has important inherent advantages, like its base of talented researchers, advanced technology, an increasingly dynamic ecosystem of young entrepreneurs working on alternative energy technologies, and ultimately also a population, the Japanese people, who are very environmentally conscious and care about climate change in principle, and who care about global solutions to the issue. So taking a proactive role in the global response to climate change will also be critical for Japan to exert global leadership, to continue its newfound role as a defender of the liberal international order, and ultimately to demonstrate that the post-war order that Japan has defended, along with the United States and other allies, is able to create solutions and meet the challenges, the greatest challenges of the 21st century.
Japan up close.